They laughed when a widowed father inherited a broken-down forest lodge nobody wanted. But when he discovered a hidden tunnel behind a false wall, what waited inside would silence every single one of them forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning fog rolled through Cedar Falls like a slow-moving ghost, clinging to the pine trees and wrapping itself around the small wooden houses that dotted the mountainside. It was the kind of Oregon town that time had forgotten, where the main street had more boarded-up windows than open shops, and where people measured their days not by ambition but by survival. Marcus walked along the gravel shoulder of the road, his worn leather tool belt hanging heavy on his hips, a thermos of cold coffee in one hand. He was 38 years old, but the lines around his eyes and the grey streaking his dark hair made him look closer to 50. 2 years of grief will do that to a man. 2 years of raising a boy alone, of working jobs that paid late or didn't pay at all, of lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if tomorrow would be the day everything finally collapsed. His truck had broken down again. 3rd time this month. The alternator this time, or maybe the starter. He couldn't afford to find out, so he walked. 4 miles from the small rental cabin he shared with his son to the Hendricks place on the other side of town, where a sagging porch needed new support beams and a family needed someone willing to work for whatever they could spare. That was Marcus now, the man who worked for whatever people could spare. He passed the Cedar Falls hardware store just as old Walt was flipping the open sign in the window. Walt saw him, gave a small nod, the kind of nod that carried pity in its corners. Marcus nodded back and kept walking. He didn't need pity. He needed $40 for groceries and another $60 for the electric bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. The Hendricks job took him most of the day. By the time he finished, his shoulders ached and his hands were raw from the cold. Mrs. Hendricks paid him in cash, $55 folded into a small envelope, and added a jar of homemade apple butter because she said he looked like he could use something sweet in his life. Marcus thanked her and started the long walk home. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains when he reached the elementary school just as the final bell rang. Children poured out of the front doors like water from a broken dam, laughing and shouting and running toward waiting cars and buses. Marcus stood at the edge of the parking lot, scanning the crowd until he spotted the one face that still made everything worth it. Dylan was 9 years old, small for his age, with his mother's soft brown eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He carried a backpack almost as big as he was and walked with the careful, measured steps of a boy who had learned too young that the world wasn't always kind. When he saw Marcus, his face lit up. "Dad!" he shouted, breaking into a run. Marcus caught him in a hug that lifted him off the ground. "Hey, buddy, how was school?" "We learned about volcanoes," Dylan said breathlessly. "Did you know there's one in Oregon that could explode any day? Like, any day, Dad. We could all be covered in lava by tomorrow." Marcus laughed, the first real laugh he'd had in days. "Well, let's hope it holds off until after dinner. You hungry?" "Starving." They walked home together, Dylan chattering about volcanoes and lava, and a kid named Tyler who had eaten 3 pudding cups at lunch and thrown up in the hallway. Marcus listened to every word, nodding in all the right places, letting his son's voice fill the empty spaces inside him that grief had hollowed out. Their cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, half a mile from the nearest neighbor. It was small, drafty, and perpetually in need of repairs Marcus couldn't afford. But it had a working wood stove and a roof that only leaked in one corner, and the rent was cheap enough that they could usually make it each month if Marcus picked up enough side jobs. Usually. Inside, Marcus started dinner while Dylan spread his homework across the kitchen table. Spaghetti with sauce from a can, garlic bread made from regular bread and butter and garlic powder. It wasn't much, but Dylan ate like it was a feast, and that was enough. "Dad?" Dylan asked between bites. "Yeah, buddy?" "Do you think Mom can see us from heaven?" Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. These questions came sometimes, usually at night, usually when Dylan was tired and his defenses were down. Marcus had learned to answer them carefully, honestly, without letting his own grief crack through. "I think so," he said quietly. "I think she watches over us every single day." Dylan nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I hope she saw my volcano drawing. I made the lava really red. She always liked red." Marcus swallowed hard. "I'm sure she loved it." That night, after Dylan was asleep, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table with the stack of bills he'd been avoiding. The electric company had sent a final notice. The truck repair estimate sat beside it, $347 he didn't have. Underneath that, a letter from Dylan's school about an upcoming field trip that cost $25 per student. He put his head in his hands and breathed. Grace would have known what to do. Grace always knew what to do. She had been the planner, the organizer, the one who could stretch a dollar until it screamed for mercy. She had been the light in every room she entered, the warmth that made their small life feel rich and full and enough. And then the cancer came. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then fatigue that rest couldn't touch. By the time they found it, the tumors had spread too far for treatment to do more than buy time. Grace died on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring, holding Marcus's hand, whispering Dylan's name with her final breath. 2 years later, Marcus still reached for her in the middle of the night, still turned to tell her something funny he'd seen, still expected to hear her voice when he walked through the door. The grief never left. You just learned to carry it differently. The next morning brought rain, the kind of cold, steady downpour that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Marcus dropped Dylan at school and walked to the post office to check their box, hoping for a check from a job he'd finished 2 weeks ago. There was no check, but there was a letter. It was a thick envelope, cream-colored, with an embossed return address from a law firm in Portland. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, his heart suddenly pounding. Law firms meant trouble. Lawsuits, maybe, or debt collectors who had finally tracked him down. He tore it open with trembling fingers. "Dear Mr. Marcus Cole," the letter began, "we are writing to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Harold Whitmore, on the 14th of last month. Mr. Whitmore has named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate, which includes a property known as Evergreen Ridge Lodge, located approximately 12 miles northeast of Cedar Falls." Marcus read the words 3 times before they made any sense. His great-uncle Harold. A man he had met exactly once, when Marcus was 7 years old, and his family had made the long drive to Oregon for some distant relative's funeral. Marcus remembered almost nothing about him, except that he was tall and quiet, and had given Marcus a pocket knife that his mother immediately confiscated. That was 31 years ago. Marcus hadn't thought about Harold Whitmore since, and now, apparently, Harold was dead. And he had left Marcus everything. The letter continued with legal language Marcus could barely pass, something about probate and transfer of deed and outstanding property taxes. At the bottom, a phone number for the attorney handling the estate and a request for Marcus to call at his earliest convenience. He called from the payphone outside the post office because his cell service had been cut off 2 months ago. The attorney's name was Richard. His voice was brisk and professional, the voice of a man who billed by the hour and didn't waste words. "The property is substantial," Richard explained. "Approximately 47 acres of forested land with a main lodge structure and several outbuildings. However, I should be direct with you, Mr. Cole. The property has been abandoned for over 4 decades. It's in significant disrepair, and there are outstanding taxes owed to the county in the amount of $12,400. Marcus's stomach dropped. $12,000. Yes. If those taxes aren't paid within 90 days, the county will seize the property. Frankly, Mr. Cole, my advice would be to let them have it. The cost of repairs alone would likely exceed any value the property might hold. Evergreen Ridge Lodge hasn't been habitable since 1982. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Why me? Excuse me? Why did he leave it to me? I barely knew him. We met once when I was a kid. Richard paused. I couldn't say. Mr. Whitmore was eccentric. He lived as a recluse for most of his adult life, had no other surviving family. Perhaps you were simply the only option. The only option. Story of Marcus's life. I need to think about it, Marcus said. Of course, but don't think too long. The county won't wait forever. That afternoon, Marcus told Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who sometimes watched Dylan after school, that he needed to run an errand. Then he drove his barely functioning truck 12 miles into the mountains, following directions he'd scribbled on the back of the attorney's envelope. The road to Evergreen Ridge Lodge was barely a road at all. Gravel gave way to dirt. Dirt gave way to mud, and mud gave way to a rutted track so overgrown that branches scraped against both sides of the truck like skeletal fingers. Twice, Marcus had to stop and move fallen limbs out of the way. Once, he nearly got stuck in a washout so deep it could have swallowed a smaller vehicle. But finally, after almost an hour of crawling through the forest, the trees opened up, and Marcus saw it. His breath caught in his throat. Evergreen Ridge Lodge rose from the mountainside like something out of a dark fairy tale. It was massive, 3 stories of timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that had partially collapsed and windows so caked with grime and weather damage that they looked like blind eyes staring out at the world. Moss and ivy had claimed entire walls. A tree had fallen through part of the roof, its branches reaching into the building like a wooden hand. The forest had spent 40 years slowly swallowing this place, and it had nearly succeeded. Marcus sat in his truck for a long time, just staring. This was his inheritance. This was what Harold Whitmore had left him. Not money, not salvation, but a ruin so complete it would take a fortune just to tear it down. He laughed. He couldn't help it. The sound echoed through the empty clearing, harsh and bitter and edged with something that might have been despair. Of course, this was what he got. Marcus Cole, the man whose wife died young, whose business failed, whose life had been one long lesson in how much the universe could take from a person before they broke. Why would his luck change now? He should have driven away, should have called Richard the attorney and told him to let the county have it. Should have gone back to Cedar Falls and picked up his son and kept grinding through days that led nowhere. But something made him get out of the truck. Maybe it was the carpenter in him, the part that couldn't look at a broken thing without wondering how to fix it. Maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself walking toward the lodge, stepping over debris and pushing through waist-high weeds until he stood at the base of the collapsed porch. Up close, he could see past the damage, could see the craftsmanship hidden beneath the decay. Whoever built this place had known what they were doing. The foundation stones were cut with precision, fitted together without mortar, the kind of work that took skill and patience and pride. The main beams, where they weren't rotted, were solid old-growth timber that would outlast anything built today. This wasn't a cheap construction job. This was a labor of love. Marcus climbed carefully onto what remained of the porch and peered through a broken window. Inside, the lodge was chaos. Furniture overturned and rotted, debris everywhere, water damage staining the walls in great brown streaks. But the bones were there. The skeleton of something that had once been beautiful. He tried the front door. It was swollen shut from decades of moisture, but he put his shoulder into it and it gave with a groan. The smell that hit him was thick and musty, the smell of time passing in enclosed spaces. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and stepped inside. The main room was enormous, a great hall with vaulted ceilings and a stone fireplace big enough to stand in. Dust motes floated in the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. Leaves and branches littered the floor where the roof had failed. Animals had clearly made their homes here, judging by the droppings and the nests tucked into corners. But God, the craftsmanship! Marcus ran his hand along a carved wooden banister, still solid despite everything. He examined the stonework around the fireplace, intricate patterns of local granite fitted together like puzzle pieces. He looked up at the ceiling beams, hand-hewn and massive, the kind of work that took months to complete. Harold Whitmore hadn't just lived here. He had built something here, something meant to last forever. So why had he let it die? Marcus stayed until the light began to fade, exploring room after room, finding evidence of a life abandoned mid-sentence, clothes still hanging in closets, dishes still stacked in cupboards, books on shelves, their pages swollen with moisture but their spines intact. It was like Harold had walked out one day and simply never returned. That night, over dinner, Marcus told Dylan about the lodge. "Can we go see it?" Dylan asked, his eyes lighting up. "Can we go tomorrow?" "It's not safe, buddy. The roof's caved in and there's debris everywhere." "But you're a carpenter. You can fix anything." Marcus smiled sadly. "I can't fix everything, Dill." "Mom said you could." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. He took a breath, steadied himself. That was different. How was it different? Marcus looked at his son, at the hope burning in those brown eyes that looked so much like Grace's, and he didn't have an answer. The next day, word got around Cedar Falls that Marcus Cole had inherited Harold Whitmore's old place. In a town that small, news traveled faster than wildfire, and by noon, it seemed like everyone had an opinion. "That place is cursed," old Mrs. Brennan told him at the grocery store. "My mother used to say strange lights came from there at night. Harold Whitmore was mixed up in something dark." "You're dreaming if you think you can fix that dump," Walt said at the hardware store, chuckling and shaking his head. "Congratulations, Marcus. You just inherited about $100,000 in demolition fees. County should have condemned it years ago," said Frank, the town's self-appointed expert on everything. "Only reason they didn't is because nobody wanted to deal with the hassle. I'd let them take it if I were you. Save yourself the headache." Marcus listened to all of it, nodded in the right places, said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing with people's certainty was a waste of breath. They had already decided what they believed, and nothing he said would change their minds. But that night, after Dylan was asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with the attorney's letter and a pad of paper, and he did the math. $12,400 in back taxes. 90 days to pay. His current savings account balance, $217. Monthly income from odd jobs. Maybe $800 on a good month, half that on a bad one. Monthly expenses. Rent, food, utilities, gas, the endless small emergencies that came with being poor. The numbers didn't work. They couldn't work. There was no scenario in which Marcus Cole, struggling carpenter, single father, could come up with $12,000 in 90 days. But he couldn't stop thinking about those foundation stones, those ceiling beams, the craftsmanship hidden beneath the decay, and he couldn't stop hearing Dylan's voice. "Mom said you could fix anything." 3 days later, Marcus loaded Dylan into the truck and drove back to Evergreen Ridge Lodge. If he was going to make a decision, if he was going to let this place go, he needed to see it one more time. Needed to say goodbye to whatever part of himself had started to dream. The second visit was harder than the first. Harder because Dylan was there, running ahead despite Marcus's warnings, exploring every corner with the fearlessness of childhood. Harder because seeing it through his son's eyes made Marcus see possibilities instead of problems. "Dad, look at this!" Dylan shouted from what had once been the library. "There's so many books!" Marcus found him standing in front of floor-to-ceiling shelves, most of the books ruined by water damage, but some on the higher shelves still intact. Dylan had pulled one down, a leather-bound volume with gold lettering on the spine. "Put that back, buddy." We don't know what shape things are in. But look, Dylan said, opening it carefully. There are pictures. It was a photo album. The pages were yellowed and spotted with age, but the photographs were still visible. Black and white images of the lodge in its prime, gleaming windows and manicured grounds. Men in suits and women in elegant dresses standing on a porch that wasn't collapsed. And in the center of many photos, a tall man with serious eyes and a woman with a warm smile standing side by side. "Who are they?" Dylan asked. Marcus studied the photographs. "I think that's Harold, my great-uncle, the man who left us this place." Dylan pointed at the woman. "Is that his wife?" "I don't know. Maybe." The last photograph in the album was different from the others. It showed Harold alone, older now, standing in front of the lodge with his arms crossed. He wasn't smiling. There was something in his eyes that Marcus recognized, something he saw every time he looked in the mirror. Grief, the particular weight of loving someone who wasn't there anymore. Dylan reached into the shelf to put the album back and knocked something loose. A smaller book fell to the floor with a thump. Marcus picked it up. It was a journal, leather-bound like the album, but smaller. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but the first line was clear enough. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the secret of Evergreen Ridge goes with me. Or perhaps not. Perhaps you will find what I have hidden. Perhaps you are meant to." Marcus's heart began to pound. He flipped through the pages, catching fragments. Dates from the 1930s and 40s, mentions of something called the Ridgeline Trust, references to a vault, to protection, to danger. "Dad!" Dylan was tugging at his sleeve. "What is it?" "I'm not sure," Marcus said slowly, "but I think we need to look at this more carefully." That night, back at the cabin, Marcus read the journal cover to cover while Dylan slept. Most of it was cryptic, written in a kind of code that suggested Harold hadn't wanted just anyone to understand. But certain passages were clear. "They came to me because they needed someone they could trust, someone who knew how to build things that lasted, someone who could keep a secret. I should have said no. I should have walked away. But the money they offered would have changed everything, and I was young and foolish enough to believe that money could solve anything. And later, the vault is complete, 47 feet into the mountain, reinforced with steel and stone. They are pleased. They speak of protection, of legacy, of keeping their fortunes safe from the chaos of the world. They do not speak of what happens when chaos comes not from the world, but from within. And finally, near the end, they are dying, one by one. I do not believe it is coincidence. Someone is eliminating everyone who knows the truth. I have sealed the tunnel and built a false wall. I will speak of this to no one. I will take this secret to my grave. May God forgive me for my part in it." Marcus sat back, his mind racing. A tunnel, a vault, something hidden so carefully that Harold had spent 40 years protecting it with silence. He should have been skeptical, should have dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man who had lived alone too long. But something about the journal felt true, felt real, felt like the missing piece of a puzzle Marcus hadn't known he was solving. The next morning, he told Dylan they were going back to the lodge. "Again?" Dylan asked, delighted. "Again. But this time, I need you to help me look for something." They spent the morning searching the main floor, looking for anything that might indicate a hidden passage or secret room. Marcus wasn't even sure what he was looking for. A hidden door, maybe, a switch or lever, something that didn't belong. It was mid-afternoon when Dylan called out from the basement stairs. "Dad, there's water down here!" Marcus descended the stairs carefully. The basement was dark and damp, the floor covered in an inch of standing water from decades of seepage. Dylan was standing near the far wall, pointing at something. "Look," he said, "that part's different." Marcus waded across the basement, his boots splashing with each step. When he reached the wall Dylan was pointing at, he stopped. The basement walls were original to the lodge, built from the same rough-hewn stones as the foundation. But this section, maybe 8 feet wide, was different. The stones were smoother, more uniform. They had been placed more recently, probably in the last 50 years rather than the original 90+. And there, at the base of the wall, was a gap, a crack where the mortar had failed and cold air was seeping through. Marcus knelt in the water and pressed his hand to the crack. The air coming through was ice cold, far colder than the damp basement around them. There was a space behind this wall, a significant one. "Dylan," Marcus said quietly, "I need you to go upstairs and wait by the truck." "But Dad—" "Please, buddy, just for a few minutes. I need to check something." When Dylan was gone, Marcus found a loose stone at the edge of the crack and began to work it free. It took time, the mortar crumbling in chunks, his fingers growing raw from the effort. But finally, one stone came loose, then another, then a third. Behind the wall was darkness. Total, absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the beam of his flashlight. But as his eyes adjusted, he could make out shapes, timber beams, a floor, and stretching into the mountain, impossibly deep, a tunnel. What happens next will turn everything Marcus thought he knew about his inheritance completely upside down, reveal a secret worth more than he could ever imagine, and remind us why sometimes the quietest men carry the most incredible stories. Stay tuned to see what Marcus finds in that tunnel. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus stood at the edge of the hole he had created, flashlight trembling in his hand, staring into a darkness that seemed to breathe. Cold air washed over him, carrying a smell he couldn't identify. Something old, something preserved. His first instinct was to call someone. The police, maybe. Or Richard the attorney. Someone who would know what to do with a hidden tunnel discovered in the basement of an inherited property. But something stopped him. Maybe it was Harold's journal, with its warnings about danger and elimination. Maybe it was the memory of how quickly word spread in Cedar Falls, how everyone already thought he was a fool for even considering keeping this place. Or maybe it was something simpler. Maybe Marcus Cole, who had spent 2 years being pitied and dismissed, who had lost everything that mattered and kept losing more every day, wanted to find something for himself, just once. Wanted to be the one who discovered what was hidden instead of the one who was always a step behind. He widened the hole in the wall, pulling away stone after stone until the opening was large enough to step through. Then he stood at the threshold, heart pounding, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel was lined with timber, the same kind of old-growth timber that made up the lodge's ceiling beams, the same skilled craftsmanship, the same attention to detail. This wasn't some amateur dig. This was professional work, built to last, built to hide something important. Marcus took one step into the tunnel, then another. The cold intensified, biting through his jacket, making his breath fog in the beam of his flashlight. The floor was smooth stone, worn by footsteps that had walked this path long before he was born. He didn't know how far he walked. Time seemed to stretch in the darkness, each step taking him deeper into the mountain, deeper into a secret that had waited 40 years to be found. The tunnel curved slightly, following the contours of the rock, and Marcus had the strange sensation of descending into the earth's throat. And then, without warning, the tunnel ended. Marcus stepped into a chamber so vast his flashlight couldn't find the far wall. He swept the beam left and right, catching glimpses of shapes in the darkness. Wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling, metal filing cabinets, safety deposit boxes arranged in neat rows on industrial shelving. And in the center of the room, like a heart in a chest of stone, a massive steel vault door. It stood at least 8 feet tall, gleaming dully in the flashlight beam, its surface unmarked by rust or age. The door was open. Marcus approached slowly, his boots echoing in the chamber. The vault door had been built to withstand almost anything, that much was clear from its construction. But someone, probably Harold, had left it ajar, a final invitation to whoever found this place. Or a final warning. Marcus stepped through the open door into the vault itself. What he saw there made his legs give way. He sat down hard on the cold stone floor, flashlight clattering beside him, and stared at the impossible thing in front of him. Stared until his eyes burned and his brain finally accepted what it was seeing. Gold. Bars of gold stacked in neat pyramids, their surfaces gleaming with a luster that decades of darkness hadn't dimmed. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Beside the gold, wooden crates marked with stencils he couldn't read. He forced himself to stand, to approach one of the crates, to pry open the lid with fingers that shook so badly he could barely grip the wood. Coins. The crate was full of coins, old ones, silver and gold, some in protective cases, others loose and spilling over each other like a pirate's treasure. Marcus moved to another crate. Bearer bonds, bundles of them, tied with twine, their faces marked with denominations that made his head spin. Another crate. Jewelry, necklaces and rings and brooches, some still in velvet boxes, others wrapped in cloth. Diamonds caught his flashlight and threw rainbows across the vault walls. In the corner, on a simple wooden table, sat a leather-bound ledger. Marcus approached it like he was approaching a sleeping dragon. He opened the cover with trembling hands and began to read. The ledger was a record, a meticulous, obsessive record of everything in the vault, every bar of gold, every coin, every bond, every jewel, catalogued by date acquired, source, and estimated value. The final page held a single entry, written in the same cramped handwriting as the journal Marcus had found in the library. Collection complete, total estimated value $260 million. May God have mercy on my soul for what I have protected. Marcus sank to his knees beside the table, the ledger falling from his hands. $260 million. He thought about Dylan waiting by the truck above, thought about the $217 in their savings account, thought about the bills piling up on the kitchen table, the truck that barely ran, the rent that was always threatening to drown them. He thought about Grace, about the way she had believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself, about how hard she had fought to live, how much she had wanted to see Dylan grow up, how unfair it was that a woman that good could be taken so young. And then, in the cold silence of a vault carved into a mountain, Marcus Cole, widowed father, struggling carpenter, man who had been laughed at and pitied and dismissed by everyone who knew him, began to cry. He cried for Grace, for Dylan, for all the years of scraping by and coming up short. He cried for the great uncle he never knew who had spent 40 years guarding this secret in isolation. He cried because the world was arbitrary and cruel, because fortune came to those who didn't deserve it and passed over those who did, because nothing made sense and everything hurt, and he was so goddamn tired of being strong. When the tears finally stopped, Marcus sat in the darkness for a long time, just breathing. Then he stood up, wiped his face with his sleeve, and picked up the ledger. There was a letter tucked into the back cover. An envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in Harold's handwriting. To whoever finds this, if you are family, read carefully. Marcus opened it with hands that had finally stopped shaking. If you are reading this, the letter began, then you have found what I spent 40 years protecting, and if you are family, then you deserve to know the truth. Marcus settled against the cold wall of the vault and began to read. The letter told a story of the Great Depression, of wealthy families who had lost faith in banks and government, of a young builder named Harold who was hired to construct a vault so secret that only a handful of people would ever know it existed, of fortunes combined and hidden, protected from a world that seemed to be falling apart. But the story didn't end there. As the years passed, Harold wrote, the families who hired me began to die, not of old age, not of natural causes. One by one, they were eliminated. I believe someone was killing them to claim the fortune for themselves. Someone who knew about the vault but did not know where it was. I was the only one who could lead them to it, so I disappeared. Built a new life at the lodge. Waited for them to come for me. They never did. Perhaps they gave up. Perhaps they died themselves. I don't know. But I kept the secret anyway, for 40 years. Too afraid to touch it. Too ashamed to give it back. Too guilty to let it go. If you are family, then I ask you to do what I could not. This fortune was built on fraud. The families who assembled it did so through theft and exploitation, cheating ordinary people during the darkest years of our nation's history. It does not belong to anyone who finds it. It belongs to the descendants of those who were wronged. I have documented everything. The ledger contains not just an inventory, but names, sources, the families who were cheated, and the amounts they lost. If you have courage I did not, you will use this information to make things right. And if you are wondering why I chose you, whoever you are, it is because your wife came to visit me. A woman named Grace. She found me somehow, drove all the way to the lodge, sat with me for an afternoon, even though I could tell she was sick, even though she must have been in pain. She told me about you, about your son. She said you were a man who fixed broken things with patience and love. She said if anyone could make this right, it would be you. I hope she was right. I hope I was right to believe her. And I hope, whoever you are, that you will do what I could not. Set this fortune free. Let it heal instead of harm. With what remains of my faith. Harold. Marcus read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it back into the ledger, and stood. Grace had visited Harold, his Grace. In the final months of her illness, when every day was a battle and every trip was an agony, she had driven to this mountain and sat with a stranger. Had told him about Marcus, had believed in him even then, even at the end. He didn't understand how, didn't understand why she had never mentioned it. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had seen something in him worth believing in, and now it was time to prove her right. Marcus walked back through the tunnel, through the hole in the basement wall, up the stairs, and out into the fading daylight. Dylan was waiting by the truck, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. "Dad!" He jumped up when he saw Marcus. "You were gone forever. Did you find something?" Marcus looked at his son, at the hope in those brown eyes, at the future he had been so afraid he couldn't provide. "Yeah, buddy," he said quietly. "I found something." "What is it?" Marcus thought about the gold, the coins, the bonds, the $260 million worth of secrets buried beneath their feet. Thought about the enemies that might still be out there, waiting. Thought about the task Harold had left him, the impossible job of setting a fortune free. And then he thought about Grace, about her voice, her laugh, her unwavering faith that broken things could be fixed. "I found a chance," Marcus said. "I found us a chance." He put his arm around his son's shoulders, and together they walked back to the truck. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. And somewhere beneath the earth, in a vault that had waited 40 years for the right person to find it, a fortune sat in darkness, patient as stone, ready to finally see the light. Marcus Cole didn't know what came next. Didn't know how he would pay the taxes, hide the discovery, protect his son, or honor Harold's final wish. The path ahead was impossible, full of dangers he couldn't yet name and enemies he couldn't yet see. But for the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than grief. He felt hope, and for now, that was enough. The drive back to Cedar Falls felt longer than it should have. The mountain roads twisted through the darkness, headlights cutting through fog that rolled in from the valleys, and Marcus gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. Beside him, Dylan had fallen asleep within minutes, his head resting against the window, his breath fogging the glass in small, rhythmic clouds. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the vault, about the gold gleaming in his flashlight beam, about Harold's letter, about Grace's name written in a dead man's handwriting, about the impossible weight of $260 million sitting beneath a mountain, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He had told Dylan they found a chance. That was true. But he hadn't told him what kind of chance, or how dangerous that chance might be. When they finally reached the cabin, Marcus carried his sleeping son inside and tucked him into bed. Then he sat at the kitchen table in the dark, Harold's journal open in front of him, and tried to make sense of everything. The journal was dense with information. Dates, names, locations, all written in Harold's cramped handwriting, all encoded in a shorthand that took hours to decipher. But slowly, piece by piece, the story emerged. In 1931, a group of 12 wealthy families from the Pacific Northwest had come together with a shared fear. The banks were failing. The stock market had collapsed. Fortunes that had seemed permanent were evaporating overnight. These families, industrialists and timber barons and railroad magnates, decided to pool their resources and hide them somewhere. No government, no bank, no economic catastrophe could touch. They hired Harold Whitmore, a young builder with a reputation for discretion and skill, to construct a vault in the mountains. They paid him more money than he had ever seen, and they swore him to absolute secrecy. The project took 3 years. Harold carved the chamber out of solid granite, reinforced it with steel and timber, installed a vault door manufactured in Switzerland, and shipped in pieces to avoid suspicion. When it was done, the families filled it with their combined wealth. Gold they had hoarded during the crash. Coins and jewelry passed down through generations. Bearer bonds worth millions. Everything portable, everything untraceable, everything hidden from a world they no longer trusted. For years, the system worked. The families prospered while others starved. They weathered the Depression, the war, the chaos of the 40s and 50s. They passed the secret down to their children and their children's children, always careful, always quiet. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Harold's journal entries from the 1970s grew darker, more paranoid. He wrote of accidents that seemed too convenient, of funerals that came too close together, of old men dying in their sleep and young heirs meeting sudden violent ends. They are being eliminated, Harold wrote in 1978. One by one. Someone is killing them. Someone who knows about the vault but cannot find it without help. I am the only one left who knows its location. I am the only one they haven't touched. And then, in 1982, the final entry. I have sealed the tunnel, built a false wall in the basement. I will speak of this to no one ever again. If they come for me, they will find nothing. And if I die with this secret, then perhaps that is what I deserve. I helped build a monument to greed. I helped protect a fortune stolen from ordinary people during their darkest hour. May God forgive me. I cannot forgive myself. Marcus closed the journal and sat in the darkness for a long time. He thought about the men in Harold's story, the wealthy families who had hidden their fortunes while the world burned around them, the heirs who had inherited secrets along with wealth, the unknown killer, or killers, who had spent years eliminating anyone who knew the truth. Were they still out there, still watching, still waiting for someone to lead them to the vault? Marcus looked at his sleeping son through the open bedroom door, at the small rise and fall of Dylan's chest, at the innocent, trusting face of a boy who had already lost too much. He couldn't tell anyone, couldn't risk word getting out, couldn't paint a target on his family's back. But he also couldn't ignore what Harold had written. The fortune in that vault wasn't just wealth. It was stolen goods, money taken from ordinary people during the Great Depression, accumulated through fraud and exploitation, hidden while families lost their homes and their hope. Keeping it felt wrong, but exposing it felt dangerous. Marcus sat with that impossible choice until the sky began to lighten outside the window. Then he made coffee, woke Dylan for school, and pretended everything was normal. The next few days passed in a fog. Marcus went through the motions of his life, taking odd jobs, fixing what needed fixing, smiling at his son when smiles were required. But his mind was always somewhere else. Always in that vault, surrounded by gold, reading Harold's words over and over. On the fourth night, after Dylan was asleep, Marcus drove back to the lodge alone. The tunnel felt different in the dark, more oppressive, more alive. The timber beams seemed to press in from the sides, and the cold air that flowed from the mountain's heart carried a weight that hadn't been there before. But Marcus pressed on, flashlight in hand, until he reached the chamber once more. This time he didn't stop at the gold, he went to the filing cabinets. Inside, he found decades of documentation. Contracts and ledgers and correspondence, all meticulously preserved, all detailing the operations of something called the Ridgeline Trust. This was the legal structure the families had created to manage their hidden fortune. On paper, it looked legitimate, an investment consortium, a collective asset protection vehicle. But the documents told a different story. Marcus spent hours reading. His eyes burned. His back ached from crouching on the cold stone floor. But he couldn't stop. The Ridgeline Trust hadn't just protected existing wealth, it had created new wealth through fraud. The families had used the chaos of the Depression to buy distressed properties for pennies on the dollar, foreclosing on farms and businesses and homes when their owners couldn't make payments. They had manipulated commodity prices, driving small producers into bankruptcy. They had bribed officials, forged documents, destroyed evidence, and they had kept records of everything. Marcus found lists of names, hundreds of them, families who had lost everything to the Ridgeline Trust's schemes. Addresses, amounts owed, dates of foreclosure, notes in the margins about resistance and settlement and removal. His stomach turned as he read. These weren't just business transactions. These were lives destroyed, families broken, communities gutted, all to feed a fortune that now sat in golden bars beneath a mountain, waiting for someone to claim it. But the most damning documents were the ones that detailed the fortune's origin. The families hadn't started with inherited wealth, at least not all of it. They had stolen much of what they protected, embezzled from businesses, defrauded investors, exploited workers during a time when workers had no power to fight back. The $260 million in that vault wasn't a legacy. It was a crime scene. Marcus sat back against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes. Grace had sent him here. Grace, who had been dying, who had known her time was short, had somehow found Harold and sat with him and talked about Marcus, had believed he was the one who could make this right. But how? How did one person undo nearly a century of theft and corruption? How did you return stolen wealth to families scattered across 3 states, most of them probably dead, their descendants unknown? It seemed impossible. But then again, so did finding $260 million in a hidden tunnel beneath an abandoned lodge. Marcus opened his eyes and looked around the chamber. At the crates and cabinets and safety deposit boxes. At the vault door standing open like a mouth waiting to speak. He had been given a choice: keep the fortune and become everything Harold had feared, or honor Harold's final wish and try to set it free. The answer, when it came, was simple. He would find a way. He didn't know how yet, didn't know where to start or who to trust, but he would find a way to return what had been stolen, even if it took years, even if it took everything he had. Grace had believed in him, Harold had trusted him, and Dylan, his beautiful boy, was watching every move he made, learning what kind of man his father would be. Marcus stood, brushed the dust from his jeans, and made a decision. He would start with the names. The ledger Marcus took from the vault that night became his obsession. He hid it in a lockbox beneath the loose floorboard in his bedroom, the same hiding spot where Grace had once kept the emergency cash they never seemed to have enough of. Every night, after Dylan was asleep, he pulled it out and studied it. There were 847 names in total, families from Oregon, Washington, and Northern California who had been defrauded by the Ridgeline Trust during the 1930s and 40s. Some entries included current addresses, at least current as of when the records were made. Others had only names and the amounts they had lost. Marcus began making lists, organizing, cross-referencing with public records he found at the Cedar Falls Library during his lunch breaks. It was slow, painstaking work, the kind that made his eyes blur and his head ache. But slowly a picture emerged. Some of the families were still traceable. Their descendants lived in the same towns where their grandparents had been cheated. Others had scattered, moved away, disappeared into the vast anonymity of America. Some lines had ended entirely, families that had died out or been destroyed by the very poverty the Ridgeline Trust had inflicted upon them. But many, perhaps most, were still out there, still struggling, still suffering the generational consequences of wealth that had been stolen 3 generations ago. Marcus thought about what that money could mean to them, thought about medical bills paid and mortgages cleared and children sent to college. Thought about the ripple effects of returning what had been taken, not as charity, but as justice. He also thought about the danger. Harold's journal had made clear that people had died for this secret. The killer or killers from the 1970s might be gone now, dead or too old to pose a threat. But the families who had benefited from the fraud, the heirs of the original 12, might still have something to lose. Marcus began researching them too. The names were harder to find. The Ridgeline Trust had been designed for anonymity, and its founders had worked hard to keep their identities hidden. But Harold's documents included correspondence, letters signed with names and addressed to homes that could be traced. What Marcus found made his blood run cold. The descendants of the original 12 families were not struggling farmers or forgotten businessmen. They were politicians, judges, corporate executives, people with power and resources and every reason to keep the Ridgeline Trust's secrets buried. One name in particular stood out: Victor Ashford. Ashford was a real estate developer based in Portland. His company, Ashford Holdings, had built half the luxury condominiums on the Oregon coast. His face appeared regularly in business magazines and newspaper society pages. He was wealthy, connected, and by all accounts ruthless. And according to Harold's documents, his great-grandfather had been one of the original 12. Marcus stared at the name for a long time. He remembered something Richard the attorney had said during their first phone call. Something about the property having interested parties over the years. Suddenly, the abandoned lodge and its back taxes made more sense. Someone had been waiting for it to go to auction, waiting to buy it cheap and tear it apart, looking for what was hidden beneath. And now Marcus had gotten there first. He thought about the choices ahead of him. He could stay quiet, pay the taxes somehow, keep the secret buried. Or he could expose everything and paint a target on his family's back. Neither option felt safe. Neither option felt right. But then he remembered Grace again. Remembered the way she had fought for every single day at the end, not because she was afraid to die, but because she wanted more time with the people she loved. She had been brave in a way Marcus wasn't sure he could match. But he could try. The next morning, Marcus made a phone call to the county tax office. The woman who answered sounded bored until he gave her the property number for Evergreen Ridge Lodge. "That property?" she said, her voice sharpening. "You're the heir?" "That's right. You've got 63 days left to pay the outstanding taxes, $12,400. If you can't pay, the county takes possession." "I understand," Marcus said, "but I have a question. Has anyone else made inquiries about this property recently?" A long pause. Then, "I'm not supposed to share that information. I'm not asking for names, just whether there's been interest." Another pause. "There's been interest," she said finally. "A lot of interest. More than I've seen for any property in 20 years. Marcus thanked her and hung up. His hands were shaking. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting. And his 63 days were already counting down. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a pad of paper and tried to think. He needed money for the taxes. He needed to protect Dylan. He needed to figure out who to trust and who to fear. And he needed to do all of it while working odd jobs and pretending everything was normal. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical force. He put his head in his hands and breathed. "Dad?" Marcus looked up. Dylan was standing in the doorway, pajamas rumpled, hair sticking up at odd angles. "Hey, buddy, what are you doing up?" "I heard you making noises." Dylan padded across the kitchen and climbed into the chair beside Marcus. "Are you okay?" Marcus looked at his son, at the concern in those brown eyes that looked so much like Grace's, at the trust that hadn't been broken yet despite everything life had thrown at them. "I'm okay," he said softly, "just thinking about stuff." "Adult stuff?" "Yeah, adult stuff." Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mum used to tell me that when things got really hard, you just had to take it one step at a time. Like when she was sick and couldn't walk very far. She said you don't have to see the whole path, you just have to see the next step." Marcus's throat tightened. "She said that?" "Yeah. She said you taught her that, when you were building houses and stuff. She said you always knew the next step, even when you didn't know how the whole thing would turn out." Marcus stared at his son, at the wisdom that children sometimes carried without knowing it, at the echo of his wife's voice coming through their boy. "You're right," he said finally, "one step at a time. So what's the next step?" Marcus thought about it, about the vault and the names and the danger, about the taxes and the deadline and the enemies he couldn't yet see. "The next step," he said slowly, "is to find someone we can trust." Dylan nodded like this made perfect sense. "Okay, can we look tomorrow?" "Yeah, buddy, we can look tomorrow." Dylan yawned, then slid off the chair and headed back to bed. At the doorway he turned. "Dad? Yeah?" "Mom said you could fix anything. I still believe that." Then he was gone, padding down the hall to his room, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of a fortune and the faith of a child. Marcus sat in the silence for a long time after Dylan left. He thought about the vault, about the names in the ledger, about Harold, who had spent 40 years protecting a secret he never wanted. And he thought about Grace, about the visit she had never mentioned, about the faith she had placed in a husband she knew would outlive her. She had given him this. Not the money, not the property, but the chance. The chance to be the man she had always believed he could be. The chance to fix something so broken most people wouldn't know where to start. Marcus looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, stained with years of honest work. The hands of a carpenter, the hands of a father, the hands of a man who had learned day by day that building something good was harder than tearing something down. One step at a time, he picked up his pen and started writing. Names of people who might help, lawyers who handled whistleblower cases, journalists who investigated corruption, accountants who knew how to trace money through decades of shell companies and hidden transactions. The list was short, the odds were long, but for the first time since he had found the tunnel, Marcus felt something other than fear. He felt purpose. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and the promise of storms to come. But inside the small cabin, a widowed father sat alone at his kitchen table, planning how to set a fortune free. And somewhere in the darkness of Evergreen Ridge Lodge, $260 million waited in silence, patient as the stone that surrounded it, ready to finally come into the light. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Marcus had found the vault. He was at the lodge measuring window frames and making notes about materials he would need when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. His heart jumped into his throat. No one came out here. The road was too rough, too hidden, too far from anything worth visiting. Marcus set down his tape measure and walked to the front of the lodge, staying in the shadows of the collapsed porch. A black SUV had pulled into the clearing, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. The engine idled for a long moment. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe mid-50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. His hair was silver and perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine despite the muddy road. He looked around the clearing like he was appraising a piece of merchandise, his expression carefully neutral. Marcus stepped into view. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cole, I presume. I'm Edward Grant. I work in historical preservation consulting." He extended a hand that Marcus didn't take. "How do you know my name?" "Public records. You inherited this property recently, correct? Quite a find. The Whitmore Lodge has been of interest to preservation societies for decades." Marcus kept his face blank. "That so?" "Absolutely. The craftsmanship here is remarkable. 1920s construction, if I'm not mistaken. There are very few examples of this architectural style remaining in the Pacific Northwest." Grant's eyes swept across the lodge's facade, then returned to Marcus. "I represent a group of investors who would be interested in purchasing the property, restoring it properly, turning it into something the community could be proud of." "It's not for sale." Grant's smile flickered. "Mr. Cole, with all due respect, you're a carpenter, single father. The back taxes on this property alone are more than most people earn in a year. I'm offering you a way out. $50,000 cash, no complications. You could pay off your debts, move somewhere more suitable." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "Who sent you?" "I don't understand the question. You show up here in a $100,000 car, wearing a suit that costs more than my truck, and you're offering $50,000 for 47 acres with a historic lodge on it. Either you think I'm stupid, or someone wants this land very badly and doesn't want me asking why." Grant's smile vanished entirely. For a moment, something cold flickered in his eyes. Then the mask returned. "I'm simply making a business proposition, Mr. Cole, but I understand if you need time to consider it." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "My number. Call when you're ready to be reasonable." He placed the card on a fallen beam near Marcus's feet, then turned and walked back to his SUV. The engine roared to life, and within seconds the vehicle was gone, disappearing down the mountain road like it had never been there at all. Marcus stood in the silence for a long time, staring at the spot where the SUV had been. Then he picked up the business card and studied it. Edward Grant, Historical Preservation Consultant, a Portland phone number. No company name, no address. He tucked the card into his pocket and went back to work. But his hands were shaking, and he couldn't stop looking over his shoulder at the empty road. That night, Marcus drove past the lodge on his way home from picking up Dylan at school. He told himself he was just checking on things, making sure everything was secure. But when he reached the turnoff for the mountain road, he saw something that made his blood freeze. A vehicle was parked at the trailhead, dark-colored, windows tinted. It wasn't Grant's SUV, but it had the same look, the same feeling of being watched. Marcus kept driving, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror until the vehicle disappeared from view. The incidents escalated over the following days. On Wednesday, Marcus came out to his truck in the morning and found all 4 tires slashed. Clean cuts, deliberate, the kind made by someone who wanted to send a message. He had to borrow money from Mrs. Patterson to get them replaced, adding another debt to the pile that never seemed to shrink. On Friday, he arrived at the lodge to find the front door hanging open. Someone had been inside. Drawers pulled out, floorboards pried up, walls examined for hidden panels. They hadn't found the basement, hadn't discovered the false wall or the tunnel behind it, but they had looked, they had searched, and they would be back. Marcus began staying at the lodge later, sometimes not leaving until well after dark. He told Dylan it was because he had a lot of work to do, which was true. But the real reason was fear. Fear of what might happen if he left the property unguarded. Fear of what someone might find if they kept looking. He started sleeping in the truck some nights, parked at an angle where he could see the road. More than once, he spotted headlights in the distance, moving slowly, stopping, then turning away. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting, and Marcus had no idea who. The answer came 2 weeks later, in the form of a letter. It arrived at the cabin, hand-delivered, no postage, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Mr. Cole, you have something that doesn't belong to you. The contents of the Whitmore property are the legal inheritance of the Ridgeline Trust and its designated heirs. You have 30 days to transfer ownership of all assets discovered on the property, or legal action will be taken. This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy." There was no signature, but at the bottom of the page, embossed in gold, was a logo Marcus recognized from Harold's documents, a mountain ridge silhouetted against a rising sun. The Ridgeline Trust, the consortium that had assembled the fortune in the first place, the families who had hidden their wealth while the world burned. They knew. Somehow, they knew what Marcus had found. He spent the next 3 days researching. The Ridgeline Trust, as a legal entity, had been dissolved in 1979. Its assets had been distributed to its member families, at least on paper. But the documents Marcus found suggested otherwise. The fortune in the vault had never been claimed, never been divided. It had simply been forgotten, or more accurately, hidden. But someone remembered. Someone had been searching for decades, buying up properties around Evergreen Ridge, waiting for the vault to surface. And now that Marcus had stumbled into the middle of their search, they wanted what they believed was theirs. Marcus dug deeper. He found news articles from the 1970s about the deaths Harold had mentioned. A car accident in Spokane, a house fire in Seattle, a drowning in Lake Chelan. All accidents, all ruled accidental, but all involving members of families connected to the Ridgeline Trust. Someone had been cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might have a claim to the fortune or knowledge of its location. And now that same someone, or their heirs, had found Marcus. The name that kept appearing in his research was Ashford. The family had been part of the original 12, one of the wealthiest and most powerful, and their current patriarch, Victor Ashford, had built an empire that stretched from Portland to Seattle, with interests in real estate, banking, and what the business press delicately called asset recovery. Marcus found an interview from 5 years ago where Ashford discussed his philosophy on inherited wealth. "Fortunes don't appear from nowhere," Ashford had said. "They're built generation by generation through discipline and vision. My family has protected what we've earned for nearly a century. We don't apologize for success." Protected. The word stuck in Marcus's throat like a bone. He thought about the 847 families in Harold's ledger. The people who had lost everything so the Ashfords and their partners could build their dynasty. The generations of poverty and struggle that had followed, all so a man in a tailored suit could talk about discipline and vision. Marcus had never considered himself a political person, had never thought much about wealth inequality or systemic injustice. He was just a carpenter, a father, a man trying to survive. But sitting in the Cedar Falls library, surrounded by printouts and old newspaper clippings, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about money. This was about right and wrong. And for maybe the first time in his life, Marcus Cole was angry. The allies came from places Marcus didn't expect. The first was Eleanor Chen, the retired librarian who had run Cedar Falls' tiny public library for 37 years before handing it over to her successor. She was 72 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and had a memory sharper than most computers. She found Marcus in the library one afternoon, surrounded by his research, and sat down across from him without asking permission. "You're looking into the Ashford family," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus tensed. "Just doing some reading." "Don't lie to me, young man. I've watched you in here every day for 2 weeks. You're looking into land records, property transfers, the Ridgeline Trust. I may be old, but I'm not blind." Marcus studied her face, looking for threat, for danger. He found only curiosity and something that might have been sympathy. "Why do you care?" he asked. Eleanor's expression softened. "Because my grandmother was one of the families they cheated. Chen isn't my married name, Mr. Cole. It's my family name. My grandmother came from China in 1922 and built a small restaurant in Tacoma. She lost everything in 1934 when the bank foreclosed on a loan she had already paid off. Forged documents, the court said. Nothing she could do." Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. "She's in the ledger?" Eleanor blinked. "What ledger?" He hesitated. Then, against every instinct screaming at him to stay silent, he told her. Not everything. Not about the gold or the vault, but about Harold's documents, about the records of fraud and theft, about the 847 families who had been robbed. When he finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across the table and gripped his hand with surprising strength. "I've waited my whole life for someone to care about this," she said. "What do you need?" Marcus told her. Over the following week, Eleanor became his researcher, his archivist, his secret weapon. She knew the library's collection better than anyone, knew where the old records were buried, which archives had been digitized, and which still sat in dusty boxes in the basement. She found him property maps from the 1930s, tax records, court documents. Piece by piece, she helped him build a picture of the fraud that had created the Ridgeline Trust's fortune. But Eleanor wasn't the only one who stepped forward. Jake Morrison was 29 years old, a Marine veteran who had come home from Afghanistan with a prosthetic leg and a case of PTSD that made normal life feel impossible. Marcus had met him 6 months ago when Jake's old man asked him to help fix up the family's barn. Jake had been sullen, withdrawn, barely speaking. But Marcus had seen something familiar in his eyes, the look of a man fighting battles no one else could see. Marcus had hired Jake to help with the barn repairs, not because he needed help, but because he thought Jake needed something to do. They had worked side by side for 3 weeks, and somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Jake had started talking, started smiling, started showing up on time instead of late. When Jake heard about the trouble at the lodge, he showed up unannounced one evening with a sleeping bag and a hunting rifle. "Heard you might need someone to keep an eye on things," he said. Marcus stared at him. "Jake, you don't have to." "Yeah, I do." Jake's jaw was set, his eyes clear. "You gave me a chance when nobody else would. Time I returned the favor." After that, Jake spent most nights at the lodge, watching the road, patrolling the perimeter. More than once, he reported seeing vehicles that turned away when they spotted his campfire. The watchers were still out there, but they weren't getting close. Even Walt, the hardware store owner who had mocked Marcus's inheritance, started coming around. He showed up one afternoon with a truck full of lumber, nails, and roofing supplies. "Heard you're fixing up the Whitmore place," he said gruffly. "Figured you could use some materials." Marcus looked at the supplies, then at Walt. "I can't afford all this." Walt waved him off. "Call it a donation, or a loan, whatever makes you feel better." He paused, then added, "Look, Cole, I know I gave you a hard time about inheriting that dump. I was wrong. What you're doing out there, trying to fix something everyone else gave up on, takes guts." Marcus didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and started unloading the truck. The biggest surprise came from Rosa Delgado. Rosa was a single mother of 3 who cleaned houses for wealthy families in the surrounding area. She and Marcus had crossed paths a few times at Dylan's school, their children in the same class. She was quiet, careful, the kind of person who watched more than she spoke. She caught Marcus in the school parking lot one afternoon, her face tight with worry. "I need to tell you something," she said, "but you can't tell anyone where you heard it." Marcus nodded slowly. "Okay. I clean for a family in Portland. Rich people, old money. The husband is always on the phone, always talking about business like I'm not even there." She took a breath. "Yesterday, I heard him mention your name. Said something about the Whitmore property, about getting you out before you figure out what you're sitting on." Marcus's blood went cold. "Did he say anything else?" "He said if you don't sell soon, they'll have to do it the hard way. I don't know what that means, but—" Rosa shook her head. "Be careful, Mr. Cole. These people, they don't play fair." Marcus thanked her and watched her walk away. Then he sat in his truck for a long time, thinking about what she had said. The hard way. He knew what that meant. Harold's journal had spelled it out clearly enough. Accidents, disappearances, problems that solved themselves when the right pressure was applied. For a moment, Marcus considered running, taking Dylan, liquidating whatever he could from the vault and disappearing into the anonymity of some distant city. He could start over. He could keep his son safe. But then he thought about Eleanor's grandmother, cheated out of everything she had built, about the 847 families whose lives had been destroyed, about Grace, who had believed he was the kind of man who fixed things instead of running from them. And he thought about Dylan, who looked at him with those trusting brown eyes and said things like, "Mom said you could fix anything," and "This is just a bigger broken thing, Dad." Marcus Cole was not going to run. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. 3 days after Rosa's warning, a certified letter arrived at the cabin. Inside was a legal complaint filed in county court, naming Marcus Cole as defendant and the Ridgeline Trust Succession Committee as plaintiff. The claim asserted that all contents discovered within or beneath the Whitmore property were the legal property of the trust's designated heirs, and demanded immediate transfer of said contents plus damages for unlawful possession. Marcus read it twice, his hands shaking. Then he called the only lawyer he knew, a public defender named Sarah, who had helped him with Grace's medical bills after the insurance company tried to weasel out of paying. Sarah listened to his summary of the situation, then let out a long, low whistle. "You're telling me there's a fortune hidden under that lodge, and now someone's suing you for it?" "That's what I'm telling you. And you have documents proving the fortune was assembled through fraud?" "Yes." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, this is way beyond my expertise. You need someone who specializes in asset recovery, trust law, maybe even federal court if this goes where I think it's going." "I can't afford someone like that." "I know. But listen, I have a friend. Her name is Diane Marsh. She used to work for the Justice Department on corruption cases. Now she does private practice, mostly pro bono stuff for whistleblowers. If your documents prove what you say they prove, she might be interested." Marcus wrote down the name. "You think she'll help?" "Only one way to find out. The meeting with Diane Marsh took place in a coffee shop in Portland, neutral ground, public enough to feel safe." She was younger than Marcus expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes and a handshake that meant business. She listened without interrupting as Marcus told his story. Then she spent an hour reviewing the documents he had brought, copies from Harold's ledger, samples of the fraud records, the legal complaint from the Ridgeline Trust. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "You understand what you're sitting on here, right?" she said. Marcus nodded. $260 million. "No, I mean yes, the money. But more than that. You're sitting on evidence of systematic fraud going back almost a century. If these documents are authentic, if they can be verified, this isn't just a property dispute. This is a case that could rewrite the history of wealth accumulation in the Pacific Northwest." Marcus swallowed hard. "So you'll help?" Diane smiled for the first time. "Mr. Cole, I've been waiting my entire career for something like this." She leaned forward. But I have to be honest with you. The people on the other side of this lawsuit, they have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, politicians, judges in their pockets. They've spent generations protecting what they stole. They're not going to give it up without a fight. I know. And you're willing to go through with it anyway, knowing what it might cost you? Marcus thought about Dylan, about Grace, about the 847 names in that ledger, the families who had never gotten justice. Yes, he said, I'm willing. Diane Marsh stood and extended her hand. Then let's get to work. The weeks that followed Diane Marsh's agreement to take the case felt like preparing for war. Marcus had never been inside a law office before, not really. He had signed paperwork for his mortgage in a conference room once, years ago, but that had been 15 minutes of signatures and handshakes. This was different. Diane's firm occupied the entire 4th floor of a Portland high-rise, with glass walls and polished floors and people in suits moving with the kind of quiet purpose that made Marcus acutely aware of the sawdust still clinging to his work boots. But Diane never made him feel small. She treated him like a partner, not a client. She explained every document, every strategy, every risk. And there were plenty of risks. The Ridgeline Trust's legal team has already filed 3 motions to have the case dismissed, she told him during one of their early meetings. They're claiming the statute of limitations has expired on any fraud claims. They're claiming the documents are forgeries. They're claiming you have no standing to bring this action. Marcus frowned. Can they do that? Just claim things that aren't true? They can claim anything they want. The question is whether a judge believes them. Diane smiled tightly. That's where the evidence comes in. The evidence was overwhelming. Harold's documents were meticulous, dated, cross-referenced with public records that still existed in county archives. Diane hired forensic accountants to verify the financial records. She brought in historians to authenticate the documents' age and origin. She assembled a team of researchers to track down the 847 families listed in Harold's ledger. It took months of late nights and early mornings, of phone calls and depositions and legal briefs that grew thicker by the day. Marcus kept working his carpentry jobs, kept picking up Dylan from school, kept pretending everything was normal while the case built momentum behind the scenes. But normal was becoming harder to maintain. The harassment didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Marcus found anonymous notes in his mailbox, threatening letters that promised consequences if he didn't drop the case. His truck was vandalized twice more. Someone spread rumors in town that he was mentally unstable, that he had made up the entire story about the vault, that he was trying to defraud innocent families out of their inheritance. Some people believed the rumors, others didn't. But the town split down the middle, and Marcus found himself walking through Cedar Falls like a ghost, acknowledged by some, avoided by others. Dylan felt it too. He came home from school one day with a black eye and a torn shirt, refusing to say what had happened until Marcus finally coaxed the story out of him. "Tyler said you were a liar and a thief," Dylan whispered. "He said his dad said you're trying to steal money that belongs to important people, so I hit him." Marcus's heart broke and swelled at the same time. He pulled his son into a hug and held him tight. "You shouldn't hit people," he said quietly, "even when they're wrong." "I know, but he was saying bad things about you." Marcus pulled back and looked into his son's eyes, those brown eyes that looked so much like Grace's. "Listen to me, Dill. What we're doing, it's going to make some people angry. People with power, people who don't want the truth to come out. They're going to say things about me, about us. Some of it will be lies. Some of it will be designed to hurt us." "Then why are we doing it?" Marcus thought about that question for a long moment. It was the same question he had asked himself 100 times, the same question that kept him awake at night. "Because it's right," he said finally. "Because there are hundreds of families out there who were cheated a long time ago, and they deserve to know what happened. They deserve to get back what was taken from them." Dylan considered this. Like Mom always said, that we should do what's right even when it's hard? Exactly like that. Dylan nodded slowly. Okay, then I'll try not to hit anyone else. Marcus smiled despite the weight in his chest. That's my boy. The breakthrough came 6 months into the legal battle. Diane had subpoenaed financial records from Ashford Holdings as part of the discovery process. Victor Ashford's lawyers had fought the subpoena tooth and nail, claiming privilege, claiming relevance, claiming everything they could think of. But the judge ruled in Diane's favor, and suddenly they had access to decades of financial data. What they found was damning. Ashford Holdings hadn't just inherited wealth from the Ridgeline Trust. They had actively managed the trust's assets for decades, even after the trust was officially dissolved. Money had flowed through shell companies and offshore accounts, laundered and reinvested until its origins were nearly impossible to trace. Nearly, but not completely. Diane's forensic accountants followed the money trail like bloodhounds. They found evidence of ongoing fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to conceal assets. They found payments to politicians and judges, bribes disguised as consulting fees and charitable donations. They found a web of corruption so vast it stretched from Portland to Washington, D.C., and at the center of it all sat Victor Ashford. This changes everything, Diane told Marcus the night they reviewed the findings. We're not just talking about historical fraud anymore. We're talking about ongoing criminal activity, federal crimes, RICO violations. Marcus stared at the documents spread across Diane's conference table, names and numbers and arrows connecting one crime to another. What does this mean for the case? It means we have leverage, real leverage. Ashford can't afford to have this go to trial. If even half of this becomes public record, his entire empire collapses. Diane leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. We can win this, Marcus. Not just the property dispute. We can bring the whole thing down. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the gold in the vault, about the $260 million that had sat in darkness for 40 years, about what that money could mean to his family, to Dylan's future. He thought about keeping it. The thought was there, unavoidable, tempting in its simplicity. He had found the fortune. He had risked everything to protect it. Legally, at least arguably, it was his. He could fight Ashford, win, and walk away with enough money to ensure that neither he nor Dylan would ever struggle again. No one would blame him. He had earned it through suffering, through loss, through the kind of persistence that most people couldn't imagine. Grace was gone. The world owed him something. But then he heard Harold's voice, echoing from the pages of that journal. This fortune destroyed everyone who touched it with greed. And he heard Grace's voice, the last words she ever spoke to him, whispered through cracked lips in a hospital bed. Take care of Dylan, and Marcus, stay good. Promise me you'll stay good. He had promised, and Marcus Cole kept his promises. I don't want to keep it, he said quietly. Diane blinked. Excuse me? The money, the fortune in the vault, I don't want to keep it. Diane stared at him like he had grown a second head. Marcus, we're talking about $260 million. I know what we're talking about. Marcus met her eyes steadily. And I know where it came from. It was stolen. Every dollar, every coin, every bar of gold. It was taken from families who lost everything while the people who stole it got rich. That was almost a century ago. Most of those families are long gone. But their descendants aren't. Marcus pulled out the ledger he had carried with him since the beginning. 847 families. Eleanor and I have been tracking them down. Some are wealthy now. They don't need anything. But hundreds of them are still struggling. Single parents, veterans, elderly people on fixed incomes. People one emergency away from losing everything. He paused. People like me. Diane was silent for a long moment. Then she said slowly, You want to give it back. I want to return what was stolen, not as charity, as justice. That's, Marcus, that's unprecedented. The logistics alone would be— I know, but it's the right thing to do. He looked at the ledger in his hands. Harold couldn't do it. He spent 40 years hiding from this decision. But Grace believed I could, and I have to try. Diane sat back in her chair and studied him with an expression he couldn't read. Finally, she smiled. You know what? I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've represented whistleblowers and victims and people who lost everything fighting the system. But I have never, not once, met someone like you. Marcus shrugged uncomfortably. I'm just a carpenter. No, Diane said. You're something much rarer than that. She stood and extended her hand. Let's figure out how to give away $260 million. The process took 18 months. Diane assembled a team of specialists, trust lawyers, forensic accountants, historians, genealogists. Together they worked through Harold's ledger name by name, tracing family trees, tracking down descendants, verifying claims. It was painstaking work. Some families were easy to find, still living in the same towns where their ancestors had been cheated. Others had scattered across the country, changed names, disappeared into the vast anonymity of modern America. A few lines had ended entirely, families destroyed by the poverty inflicted upon them generations ago. But slowly, the list took shape. 623 verified descendants of the original 847 families. People scattered across Oregon, Washington, California, and beyond. Some wealthy, some comfortable, many struggling. Marcus established a foundation to manage the distribution. He named it after Grace, the Grace Cole Restitution Fund. The name felt right. Grace had started this journey, even if she never knew it. She had visited Harold, had spoken to him about Marcus, had planted the seed that would eventually bloom into something neither of them could have imagined. The Foundation's mission was simple: return what had been stolen, with interest. Forensic accountants calculated what each family had lost, adjusted for inflation and compound growth. Some payments were small, a few $1,000s, others were substantial, 6 figures or more. But every payment came with a letter explaining its origin, explaining the fraud, explaining that this wasn't charity, but justice. Marcus didn't keep the entire fortune for himself, but he didn't walk away empty-handed either. Diane helped him negotiate a settlement with the court. As the legitimate heir to the Whitmore property and the person who had discovered and documented the fraud, Marcus was entitled to a finder's fee. 10% of the recovered assets, $26 million. It was more money than he could comprehend, more than he had ever imagined possessing. But it came with conditions Marcus imposed on himself. He would use the money to restore Evergreen Ridge Lodge. He would create a retreat center for grieving families and struggling single parents. He would build something that honored Grace's memory and Harold's sacrifice. The rest would go where it belonged, back to the families who had been robbed. The first checks went out on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Marcus didn't send them anonymously. He wanted the recipients to understand what they were receiving and why. Each check came with a packet of documentation: copies of the original fraud records, photographs of the vault, a letter from Marcus explaining the history behind the payment. The responses started coming within days. A woman in Seattle called the Foundation's office in tears. Her grandmother had lost a small grocery store during the Depression, foreclosed on a forged loan. The family had never recovered. 3 generations of poverty, of struggle, of wondering what might have been. The check she received, $47,000, would pay off her mortgage and send her daughter to college. A veteran in Tacoma wrote a handwritten letter. His great-grandfather had been swindled out of a fishing boat, the family's only source of income. The man had died broken and bitter, and that bitterness had poisoned every generation since. The restitution payment, $18,000, wasn't about the money. It was about knowing that someone finally acknowledged what had happened, that someone cared enough to make it right. Eleanor Chen received her family's payment in person. Marcus drove to her small apartment in Cedar Falls and handed her the check himself. $93,000, representing what her grandmother's restaurant would have been worth if it hadn't been stolen. Eleanor stared at the check for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "My grandmother died believing no one would ever know," she whispered. "She told my mother, and my mother told me, but we never had proof. We never had anyone who believed us." Marcus took her hands gently. "I believe you. And now the world will too." The story went national 3 months later. Diane had timed the media release carefully, waiting until the fraud documentation was fully verified, until the foundation was operational, until the first wave of restitution payments had been distributed. Then she contacted a journalist she trusted, a woman who had built her career exposing corporate corruption. The article ran on a Sunday morning, front page of the Portland Tribune, with the headline, "Carpenter Uncovers Century of Fraud, Returns $260 million to Victims." By Monday, it had been picked up by national outlets. By Wednesday, Marcus was fielding interview requests from major networks, cable news, magazines he had never heard of. Everyone wanted to talk to the man who had found a fortune and given it away. Marcus declined most of the requests. He wasn't comfortable with cameras, with sound bites, with the performative aspects of media attention. But Diane convinced him to do a few carefully selected interviews, enough to get the Foundation's mission into the public eye. "People need to see you," she told him. "They need to understand that this isn't just about money. It's about integrity. It's about doing the right thing when no one would have blamed you for doing otherwise." So Marcus did the interviews. He sat in studios with bright lights and careful makeup, feeling like an imposter in his borrowed suit. He answered questions about the vault, about Harold, about Grace. He tried to explain why he had made the choices he had made. "I'm not a hero," he said during one interview. "I'm just a carpenter who found something that didn't belong to me and tried to give it back. That's not heroic. That's basic decency." The host smiled indulgently. "But Mr. Cole, most people wouldn't have done what you did. Most people would have kept the money." Marcus shook his head. "Then most people would have been wrong. This fortune was built on other people's suffering. Keeping it would have been like accepting stolen goods. It doesn't matter how long ago the theft happened. Wrong is wrong." The interview aired that night. The next morning, donations to the Grace Cole Restitution Fund increased by 300%. Strangers sent checks, wrote letters, offered to volunteer. Corporations reached out about matching gift programs. A tech billionaire Marcus had never heard of pledged $5 million to expand the foundation's work. But the attention brought danger too. Victor Ashford's legal team had collapsed along with his reputation. The fraud documentation had been devastating, exposing generations of crimes that the Ashford family had hidden behind respectability and wealth. Federal prosecutors had gotten involved, launching investigations into tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy. Ashford himself had retreated from public life, his name now synonymous with inherited corruption. But not everyone connected to the Ridgeline Trust was willing to fade quietly. The threats escalated in the weeks after the national coverage. Anonymous calls to the foundation office. Dead animals left on Marcus's doorstep. Someone spray-painted "traitor" on the side of his truck. Jake Morrison took over security full-time, moving into a small cabin near the lodge and patrolling the property day and night. The sheriff increased patrols on the road. Diane hired private security for the foundation office. Marcus tried to shield Dylan from the worst of it, but children see more than adults realize. One night, Marcus found his son sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkness. "Dad," Dylan said quietly. Are bad people going to hurt us? Marcus sat down beside him. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, I promise. But what about you? Marcus put his arm around his son and pulled him close. We're going to be okay, buddy. We have friends now. People who are looking out for us. And the bad people, they're scared. That's why they're acting this way. Because they know what we're doing is right, and they can't stop it. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mom would be proud of you. Marcus's throat tightened. You think so? Yeah. She always said you were brave, even when you didn't feel like it. Marcus held his son in the darkness and didn't trust himself to speak. The restoration of Evergreen Ridge Lodge took 2 years. Marcus did much of the work himself, with help from the community that had slowly rallied around him. Walt from the hardware store led a crew of volunteers who showed up every weekend to haul debris and frame walls. Jake supervised the security installations and outdoor infrastructure. Rosa Delgado, who had warned Marcus about Ashford's plans, took over management of the retreat center operations. Even Dylan helped, learning to swing a hammer and read blueprints, working beside his father the way Marcus had once worked beside his own. The lodge was transformed. The collapsed porches were rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before. The roof was replaced, the windows restored, the interior renovated with a mix of modern amenities and historical preservation. The Great Hall with its massive stone fireplace became a gathering space for families seeking refuge. The library became a reading room filled with donated books. The bedrooms became retreat quarters, comfortable and warm, designed to feel like home. And in the basement, behind the false wall that Marcus chose to preserve, the tunnel and vault became a museum. The museum told the story of the Ridgeline Trust, its origins in Depression-era fear and greed, its decades of fraud and exploitation, its eventual exposure, and the justice that followed. Photographs lined the walls, documents were displayed in glass cases, and audio recordings played testimonials from descendants who had finally received what their families were owed. The vault itself was preserved exactly as Marcus had found it, minus the fortune it had once contained. Visitors could walk through the tunnel, stand in the chamber, and see the empty shelves where gold had once gleamed. A plaque at the entrance explained what had been there and where it had gone. This vault held $260 million in stolen wealth for over 40 years, the plaque read. It was discovered by Marcus Cole in 2023 and returned to the descendants of those who were cheated. This space now stands as a reminder that no fortune built on injustice can last forever, and that ordinary people have the power to make things right. The grand opening of the Evergreen Ridge Retreat Center took place on a warm Saturday afternoon in late summer. Cars lined the mountain road for nearly a mile. Families who had received restitution payments came from across the country, some driving for days to be there. Journalists and dignitaries and curious locals filled the restored Great Hall to overflowing. Marcus stood on the rebuilt porch, watching the crowd gather, feeling like he was dreaming. 2 years ago, he had been a struggling carpenter, a widowed father, a man with nothing but debt and grief. He had inherited what everyone said was worthless, a ruin that should be demolished and forgotten. Now he stood in front of something beautiful, something that would help people for generations to come, something that proved Grace had been right to believe in him. Dylan stood beside him, 11 years old now, taller than he had been, growing into the young man he would become. He wore a suit for the occasion, borrowed and slightly too large, and kept tugging at the collar. "You ready?" Marcus asked. Dylan nodded nervously. "I think so." "You're going to do great." They had practiced the speech together, the story Dylan would tell during tours of the museum, the story of Harold Whitmore and his decades of silence, the story of Grace Cole and her final act of faith, the story of a fortune hidden and found and set free. The ceremony began with Diane Marsh introducing the retreat center's mission, then Eleanor Chen speaking about her family's experience with the fraud. Jake Morrison talked about the healing that could happen when people had a safe place to be vulnerable. Rosa Delgado explained the programs they would offer: grief counseling, parenting support, job training, financial literacy. Then it was Marcus's turn. He walked to the microphone feeling like his legs might give out. Public speaking had never been his strength. He was a man who worked with his hands, who expressed himself through action rather than words. But some things needed to be said. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, I bought this property for the back taxes, $12,400. Everyone told me I was crazy. Everyone said it was worthless, cursed, a money pit. They laughed when they heard what I had inherited. The crowd was silent, listening. But my wife, Grace, used to say that you can't judge something by what it looks like on the outside. You have to look deeper. You have to see what's underneath. He paused, gathering himself. What I found underneath this lodge was a secret that had been buried for 40 years. A fortune worth $260 million, built on fraud, hidden from the world. He looked out at the faces in the crowd. Families who had been helped, friends who had supported him, strangers who had come to see what all the fuss was about. I could have kept it. The law would probably have let me, and God knows my son and I could have used the money. But my wife also taught me something else. She taught me that how you get something matters as much as what you get, that a fortune built on other people's suffering isn't worth having. He felt his voice crack and paused to steady it. So we gave it back. Every dollar we could trace, we returned to the families it was stolen from, and with what was left, we built this place. Not for me, not for profit, but for people who need somewhere to heal, somewhere to hope, somewhere to remember that even when the world is hard, there are still people trying to make it better. The applause started slowly, then built into something that shook the walls. After the speeches, as the crowd dispersed and people wandered through the lodge, a woman approached Marcus. She was middle-aged, with grey streaking her dark hair and tears running down her cheeks. "Mr. Cole," she said, "my name is Margaret. My grandmother was Elena Santos." Marcus recognized the name. It was one of the first on Harold's list. The Santos family had lost a small farm in Northern California in 1935. The restitution payment had been among the largest, nearly $170,000. "I received your check 6 months ago," Margaret said. "I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was some kind of scam. But then I read the documents you sent, and I started crying, and I couldn't stop for 3 days." Marcus didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry for—" "No," Margaret shook her head firmly. "Don't apologize. My grandmother died when I was 15. She used to tell me stories about the farm she grew up on, how beautiful it was, how happy her family had been there, and then she would get this look in her eyes, this sadness that never went away, and she would say, 'But it was taken from us, Mia, and no one cared.'" Margaret's voice broke. "She died believing no one cared. She died thinking the world had forgotten what happened to her family. And now, all these years later, someone remembered. Someone cared enough to make it right." She reached out and took Marcus's hands in hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving my grandmother her story back." Marcus held her hands and felt tears running down his own face. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "Thank a man named Harold who spent 40 years protecting this secret because he couldn't figure out how to set it free. And thank a woman named Grace who believed that fixing broken things isn't about making them perfect, it's about making them matter." Margaret hugged him then, a stranger embracing him like family, and Marcus let himself be held. That evening, as the sun began to set over the mountains, Marcus and Dylan stood on the rebuilt porch and watched the last visitors drive away. The lodge glowed golden in the fading light, its windows gleaming, its walls strong, its purpose finally fulfilled. "Dad?" Dylan said quietly. "Yeah, buddy. Do you think Mom can see this?" Marcus looked out at the mountains, at the sky painted in shades of orange and purple, at the world that had somehow become beautiful again. "Yeah," he said, "I think she can." They stood together in the silence, father and son, watching the day end. Behind them, the lodge waited, ready to welcome families who needed healing. In the basement, the museum preserved a story of greed and justice. And somewhere in the ether, maybe, a woman named Grace smiled at what her faith had built. Marcus thought about all the things he had lost: his wife, his certainty, his old life. But he thought too about what he had gained: purpose, community, the knowledge that he had done something that mattered. The townspeople who had laughed now volunteered at the lodge. Walt had built the new porch with his own hands, donating weeks of labor to make it perfect. Eleanor Chen ran the museum, telling her grandmother's story to everyone who would listen. Jake led wilderness therapy hikes for veterans, finding his own healing and helping others find theirs. Rosa managed the retreat center with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. And Marcus? Marcus was still a carpenter, still a father, still a man who worked with his hands and measured his worth in things built rather than things owned. But he was also something more now: proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, proof that a fortune given away was worth more than one kept, proof that Grace had been right all along. "Dad," Dylan said again. "Yeah? I'm glad we didn't keep the money." Marcus smiled and put his arm around his son. "Me too, buddy, me too." The stars were beginning to emerge overhead, scattered across the darkening sky like promises waiting to be kept. Marcus Cole, widowed father, struggling carpenter, man who had been laughed at and pitied and dismissed by everyone who knew him, stood in front of the lodge he had rebuilt and the legacy he had created, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the absence of pain, not the end of struggle, but the quiet certainty that comes from knowing you have done the right thing, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Grace had believed in him, Harold had trusted him, and 847 families, scattered across 3 states, now had their stories back. That was worth more than gold, worth more than any fortune hidden in any vault. That was worth everything. As the last light faded from the sky, Marcus and Dylan walked inside the lodge together. The great hall was empty now, chairs stacked neatly along the walls, the stone fireplace cold but ready for its first fire of the season. Dylan looked around at the space, at what they had built, at what it represented. "Mom would have loved this," he said quietly. "She would have," Marcus agreed. "She really would have." They stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by silence and possibility. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of tomorrow. The mountains stood watch over the valley, eternal and patient, keeping secrets of their own. And Evergreen Ridge Lodge, once abandoned and forgotten, now glowed with the light of second chances. Because anyone can rebuild something broken if they're brave enough to try. Anyone can give back what was stolen if they care enough to look. And anyone can change the world, one small act of courage at a time. All it takes is someone willing to do what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Marcus Cole was that someone, a carpenter, a father, a man who found a fortune and gave it away, and in the end that made him richer than any vault could ever hold. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of hope, heart, and second chances. Click to keep watching with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the greatest treasures are the ones we share.